The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the tall windows of the Anderson Software headquarters in downtown Seattle, where Sophie Chen sat nervously adjusting her blazer. At 28, she had already defied countless odds to reach this moment. Though no one in the bustling tech company could have guessed her extraordinary journey just by looking at her. Her sleek black hair was pulled back in a professional bun, and her dark eyes sparkled with intelligence behind stylish glasses, the perfect image of a successful tech writer and programmer. "Ms. Chen?" The receptionist's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mrs. Anderson will see you now." Sophie's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just any meeting with a potential client. This was an interview with Eleanor Anderson, one of Seattle's most influential tech executives and a notoriously demanding personality. Taking a deep breath, Sophie stood and smoothed her navy pencil skirt, a practiced gesture that helped calm her nerves. The walk to Eleanor's corner office felt like crossing an ocean. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the Seattle skyline stretched out against the backdrop of Puget Sound, a view that usually inspired Sophie, but now only intensified her awareness of how far she'd come and how much farther she had to go. Eleanor Anderson sat behind an impressive mahogany desk, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her posture rigid with old money elegance. She didn't look up immediately when Sophie entered, a power play that Sophie recognized from years of dealing with authority figures who underestimated her. "Please sit," Eleanor finally said, gesturing to one of the leather chairs facing her desk. Her voice carried the polished accent of someone who had attended the finest East Coast schools. "Your portfolio is quite interesting." Sophie took her seat, maintaining the confident pose she'd perfected over years of proving herself. "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I'm particularly proud of my series on making artificial intelligence accessible to the general public." "Yes, I saw that." Eleanor's perfectly manicured fingers tapped against a folder containing Sophie's writing samples. "Though I must admit I'm curious about your background. Your bio mentions you're self-taught in programming." It was a familiar question, one that usually preceded either dismissal or fascination. "That's correct," Sophie replied, her voice steady. "I began learning to code while working as a janitor at the University of Washington's Computer Science Building. The professors there were kind enough to let me audit classes during my breaks." Eleanor's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in her composed facade. "How resourceful. And now you write for major tech publications." "Yes, I've found that my unique perspective helps me bridge the gap between complex technical concepts and the average reader." Sophie leaned forward slightly, warming to her subject. "Technology shouldn't be intimidating. Everyone deserves to understand the tools that shape our world." A slight smile played at the corners of Eleanor's mouth. "That's precisely why I called you in today, Ms. Chen. Anderson Software is launching a new artificial intelligence platform, and we need someone who can explain its capabilities to the public without causing panic about robots taking over the world." She paused, studying Sophie with renewed interest. "My son, Caleb, specifically recommended your work." Sophie's heart stuttered at the mention of Caleb Anderson. She'd met him briefly at a tech conference last month, where he'd given a fascinating presentation on language processing algorithms. With his quiet intelligence and kind eyes, he'd stood out from the usual tech bros who dominated such events. They'd talked for hours afterward about the intersection of technology and linguistics, his specialty as a professor of computational linguistics at the University of Washington. "Caleb mentioned you might be interested in this project," Sophie said carefully, trying to keep her voice professional despite the warm memory of their conversation. "Indeed." Eleanor's piercing gaze seemed to be searching for something in Sophie's expression. "He was quite impressed by your articles, though I must say your background is unconventional for someone we'd typically work with." The familiar sting of judgment pricked at Sophie's confidence, but she'd long ago learned to transform such moments into opportunities. "Unconventional perspectives often lead to innovative solutions, Mrs. Anderson. My experience has taught me how to communicate complex ideas to diverse audiences, exactly what your AI platform needs." Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. Finally, she nodded. "You make a compelling argument, Ms. Chen. We'll start with a 3-month contract. I expect weekly progress reports and direct oversight of all content before publication." "Of course," Sophie agreed, maintaining her professional composure despite the triumph singing in her veins. I won't disappoint you. See that you don't. Eleanor's tone carried a weight of warning. Caleb will be your primary point of contact for the technical aspects of the project. I trust you can maintain appropriate professional boundaries. The question carried an undercurrent that Sophie couldn't quite decipher, but she met Eleanor's gaze steadily. Absolutely, Mrs. Anderson. I take my work very seriously. As Sophie left the Anderson Software building that afternoon, the Seattle drizzle felt refreshing against her face. She'd done it, landed another major client, another step toward the stability she'd dreamed of during those long nights studying borrowed textbooks in the empty university hallways. The fact that it would mean working closely with Caleb Anderson was just a coincidence, she told herself firmly, ignoring the way her pulse quickened at the thought. Walking toward her bus stop, Sophie pulled out her phone to text her elderly roommate, Mrs. Wu, that she'd be home in time to help with dinner. The arrangement they'd struck 2 years ago, reduced rent in exchange for helping around the house, had been a blessing for both of them. Mrs. Wu got the assistance she needed, and Sophie got a safe, affordable place to live while building her career. Still, as the bus wound through Seattle's hills toward the modest Beacon Hill neighborhood she called home, Sophie couldn't help but dream of the day she'd have a place of her own. She'd learned long ago not to expect fairy tale endings. The orphanage had taught her that lesson well, but she'd also learned that with enough determination and hard work, she could write her own story. Little did she know, her new position at Anderson Software was about to open a chapter she never could have anticipated. The following weeks passed in a blur of meetings, writing sessions, and increasingly frequent interactions with Caleb Anderson. Sophie found herself looking forward to their technical briefings, which often evolved into fascinating discussions about the future of AI and its impact on society. Caleb's passion for his work was infectious, and his quiet wisdom reminded her of the kindly professors who had mentored her during her years at the university. One rainy Thursday afternoon, they were reviewing the latest draft of Sophie's article about Anderson Software's AI ethics guidelines when Caleb suddenly looked up from his tablet. "Would you like to get coffee? There's this great little place around the corner." Sophie hesitated, Eleanor's warning about professional boundaries echoing in her mind. But surely coffee to discuss work was acceptable. "That would be nice," she found herself saying. "I could use a break from the office." The cafe was a cozy hideaway, with worn leather armchairs and the rich aroma of freshly ground beans. As they settled into a quiet corner, Sophie couldn't help but notice how Caleb's usual reserved demeanor seemed to relax away from the corporate environment. "You know," he said, stirring his Americano thoughtfully, "I've been meaning to ask, what made you choose tech writing? With your programming skills, you could be developing software instead of just writing about it." Sophie wrapped her hands around her chai latte, appreciating its warmth. "I love coding, but I've seen how technology can intimidate people who don't understand it. I wanted to be a bridge." She paused, debating whether to share more. "When I was younger, knowledge felt like a lifeline. I want to make sure others have access to that same lifeline." Caleb's brown eyes softened with interest. "That's really admirable. Most people in tech are more concerned with impressing their peers than helping others understand." "What about you?" Sophie asked, genuinely curious. "How did a linguistics professor end up working on AI projects?" "Ah, that's my mother's influence," he admitted, with a self-deprecating smile. "She always wanted me more involved in the family business. Teaching linguistics was my small act of rebellion, but when the AI language processing project came up," he shrugged. "It was a perfect blend of both worlds." Their conversation flowed easily, touching on everything from favorite coding languages to beloved books. Sophie found herself sharing stories about Mrs. Wu's cooking adventures and her own dreams of eventually starting a tech education non-profit for underprivileged youth. "You're not what I expected," Caleb said suddenly, his expression thoughtful. "Oh?" Sophie raised an eyebrow. "And what did you expect? Someone more hardened, I suppose, given how successful you've become in such a competitive field." He looked slightly embarrassed. "Instead, you're a soft-hearted nerd who gets excited about Python updates," she suggested with a laugh. "Genuine," he finished quietly. "It's refreshing." The intensity of his gaze made Sophie's heart flutter, and she quickly glanced at her watch. "We should probably head back. Your mother's expecting that draft by 5. The mention of Eleanor seemed to break the spell. Caleb straightened in his chair, his professional mask sliding back into place. Of course, we wouldn't want to keep her waiting. As they walked back to the office, Sophie tried to ignore the way their hands occasionally brushed, sending little sparks of electricity up her arm. This was dangerous territory. Eleanor Anderson had made it clear that Sophie's role was strictly professional, and Sophie had worked too hard to risk her career over an attraction to the boss's son. But later that night, as she helped Mrs. Wu prepare dinner in their small kitchen, her elderly roommate noticed her distraction. "Something on your mind, dear?" the older woman asked, her accent thick, but her perception sharp as ever. "Just work," Sophie deflected, focusing on chopping vegetables for their stir-fry. Mrs. Wu made a skeptical sound. "In all the time I've known you, work has never made you smile like that at your cutting board." Sophie felt her cheeks warm. "It's nothing really, just a nice conversation with a colleague." "Ah, young love," Mrs. Wu said wisely, ignoring Sophie's spluttered protest. "You know, when I first came to Seattle, I had nothing but determination and a suitcase full of dreams. But look at me now, my own house, good friends, a wonderful young lady to keep me company." She patted Sophie's hand. "Don't let fear of the past keep you from embracing the future." "It's not that simple," Sophie sighed, thinking of Eleanor's carefully maintained walls of privilege and propriety. "Some people, they see where you came from before they see who you are." "Then they are fools," Mrs. Wu declared firmly. "You are like Jade, beautiful, not despite the pressure that formed you, but because of it." Sophie smiled at the metaphor, touched by her friend's faith in her. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars she'd never taken down from her ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing on the edge of something both wonderful and dangerous. Her phone buzzed with a text message. "Great work on the draft today, looking forward to our next meeting. Caleb." Sophie pressed her pillow over her face to muffle her groan. Professional boundaries were going to be a lot harder to maintain than she'd thought. The Seattle spring brought cherry blossoms and increasingly frequent working lunches between Sophie and Caleb. Their meetings, which had started as strictly professional discussions about Anderson Software's AI project, gradually evolved into something more personal. They found themselves sharing window seats at quiet cafes, talking long after their coffee had gone cold. One particularly sunny afternoon, they sat in a hidden courtyard near Pike Place Market, watching seagulls wheel overhead. Sophie was explaining her latest article idea when she noticed Caleb watching her with an intensity that made her lose her train of thought. "I'm sorry," he said, though his smile suggested he wasn't sorry at all. "It's just, you light up when you talk about making technology accessible. It's captivating." Sophie felt her cheeks warm. "It's important to me. Technology shouldn't be a barrier. It should be a bridge. Like you," Caleb said softly. When Sophie looked confused, he continued, "You're a bridge too, between different worlds, different perspectives. I've never met anyone quite like you." The sincerity in his voice made Sophie's heart race, but she forced herself to maintain her professional composure. "Caleb, have dinner with me," he interrupted. "Not as colleagues, as us." Sophie's breath caught. "Your mother is not in charge of my personal life," Caleb finished firmly. "I'm 32 years old, Sophie. I can make my own choices." The determination in his voice was new. Usually, Caleb was the epitome of calm rationality. This passionate side of him was unexpected, and Sophie had to admit incredibly attractive. Still, she hesitated. "I've worked so hard to build my reputation in this industry. If this goes wrong, it won't," Caleb said with quiet confidence. Then, more softly, "I know what I want, Sophie, do you?" The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. Sophie thought about Mrs. Wu's words about not letting fear of the past dictate her future. She thought about all the times she'd played it safe, all the walls she'd built to protect herself. "Yes," she finally said, surprising herself with her certainty. "Dinner would be nice." Caleb's smile was radiant. "Saturday? I know a great little Italian place in Capitol Hill." They spent the rest of their lunch break planning their date, both pretending not to notice how their hands had drifted closer together on the table between them. Back at the office, Sophie threw herself into her work, trying to ignore the butterflies in her stomach. She was reviewing the latest analytics for her AI articles when a shadow fell across her desk. Looking up, she found Eleanor Anderson standing there, her expression unreadable. "Ms. Chen, might I have a word?" Sophie followed Eleanor to her office, her professional mask firmly in place. The older woman closed the door and took her seat behind the mahogany desk, studying Sophie with calculating eyes. "Your articles have been performing exceptionally well," Eleanor began, her tone neutral. "Our social media engagement has increased by 40% since you joined the team." "Thank you, Mrs. Anderson. I'm glad the content is resonating with readers." "Indeed." Eleanor tapped her perfectly manicured nails against her desk. "Which is why I'm offering you a permanent position with Anderson Software. Full benefits, competitive salary, stock options." Sophie blinked in surprise. This was an incredible opportunity, the kind of stability she'd dreamed of for years. But something in Eleanor's expression made her wary. "That's very generous," Sophie said carefully. "There would, of course, be certain expectations," Eleanor continued smoothly, "including maintaining appropriate professional relationships within the company." The implied meaning was clear. Somehow Eleanor knew about Sophie's growing closeness with Caleb. "Mrs. Anderson," Sophie began, but Eleanor held up a hand to stop her. "I've worked hard to build this company's reputation, Ms. Chen. The Anderson name means something in Seattle. We can't afford distractions." Sophie felt her spine stiffen. "With all due respect, Mrs. Anderson, my personal life has never affected my professional performance." "Perhaps not yet." Eleanor's smile was razor-sharp, but office romances have a way of becoming messy, particularly when they cross certain social boundaries. The implication stung, but Sophie refused to show it. "Are you suggesting that my background makes me unsuitable for professional advancement?" "Not at all." Eleanor's voice was smooth as silk. "I'm merely pointing out that there are certain realities to consider. The tech world can be quite traditional in some ways." Sophie stood, her hands steady despite her racing heart. "Thank you for the offer, Mrs. Anderson. I'll need time to consider it." "Of course." Eleanor's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Take the weekend to think it over. I'm sure you'll make the right decision." Walking back to her desk, Sophie felt as if she were moving through a fog. The offer was everything she'd worked for: security, recognition, a chance to make a real impact in the tech world. But the strings attached felt like chains. Her phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. "Can't stop thinking about Saturday. Hope you like tiramisu." Sophie closed her eyes, letting out a shaky breath. She'd spent her whole life fighting for her place in the world, refusing to let others define her worth. She wasn't about to start now. Opening her eyes, she typed back, "Looking forward to it. And I love tiramisu." Some things, she decided, were worth fighting for. Saturday evening found Sophie standing in front of her mirror, second-guessing her outfit choice for the 10th time. "Mrs." Wu watched from the doorway, a knowing smile on her face. "The green dress is perfect," the older woman assured her. "It brings out the gold in your eyes." Sophie smoothed the silk material nervously. The dress was her one luxury purchase, bought with her first big freelance check. "Are you sure it's not too much?" "It is exactly enough," Mrs. Wu said firmly, stepping forward to adjust Sophie's necklace, a delicate jade pendant she'd given Sophie for her last birthday. "Now go. Don't keep your handsome professor waiting." The Italian restaurant was tucked away on a quiet street, its warm lights glowing invitingly in the twilight. Caleb was waiting outside, looking dashingly different from his usual office attire in a well-fitted dark blue suit. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw Sophie. "You look beautiful," he said softly, offering his arm. Inside, they were led to a cozy corner table, candlelight dancing across the white tablecloth. As they settled in, Sophie noticed how different Caleb seemed outside the office, more relaxed, more himself. "I have a confession to make," he said after they'd ordered. "I've been wanting to ask you out since that first tech conference, but I was afraid you'd say no." Sophie raised an eyebrow. "The brilliant Professor Anderson afraid of rejection?" "Terrified," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "You're intimidating, you know. Brilliant, beautiful, completely self-made. Next to that, being born into privilege feels rather unimpressive." "Being born into privilege doesn't define you," Sophie said. "It's what you do with it that matters." She paused, then added more quietly, "Your mother might disagree, though." Caleb's expression clouded. "She offered you the permanent position, didn't she?" Sophie nodded, studying her wine glass. with some very specific conditions attached. I'm sorry. Caleb reached across the table to take her hand. My mother, she's always tried to control everything in her sphere of influence, including me. She's protective of the Anderson legacy, Sophie said diplomatically. She's a snob, Caleb corrected bluntly. And she's wrong about you. About us? The warmth of his hand on hers sent tingles up Sophie's arm. There's an us already? I hope so. His thumb traced patterns on her palm. Unless you're planning to let my mother's prejudices dictate your choices. Sophie thought about Eleanor's thinly veiled warnings, about all the times in her life people had tried to tell her what she couldn't do, couldn't be. No, she said firmly. I don't let anyone dictate my choices. Caleb's smile was worth any risk. They spent the rest of dinner talking about everything and nothing, their hopes, their fears, their dreams. Sophie told him about growing up in the orphanage, about the kind librarian who'd first introduced her to computers. Caleb shared stories about rebelling against his family's expectations, about finding his passion in linguistics, despite pressure to focus on business. After dinner, neither wanting the evening to end, they walked along the waterfront. The Seattle skyline glittered across the dark water, and a cool breeze carried the salt scent of Puget Sound. Tell me something you've never told anyone else, Caleb said as they leaned against the railing, shoulders touching. Sophie was quiet for a moment, then said, Sometimes I still feel like that little girl in the orphanage, trying to prove she deserves to take up space in the world. Caleb turned to face her, his expression serious. You don't have to prove anything, Sophie. You're extraordinary just as you are. The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. Even without a prestigious family name? Especially without one, he stepped closer, reaching up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. You've built everything you have through sheer determination and brilliance. That's far more impressive than being born an Anderson. Sophie's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must be able to hear it. Caleb, I'm going to kiss you now, he murmured, his hand cupping her cheek. Unless you have any objections. Instead of answering, Sophie raised up on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, then deepened as Caleb pulled her closer. Sophie felt as if her whole body was lighting up from the inside, like stars bursting into life. When they finally pulled apart, both slightly breathless, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. I think I'm falling for you, Sophie Chen. That could be complicated, she whispered, though she made no move to step away. The best things usually are, he smiled, brushing another soft kiss across her lips. But I think you're worth any complication. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms with the Seattle night sparkling around them, Sophie allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, some fairy tales could come true after all. Not the kind with magical solutions and perfect endings, but the kind built on courage, determination, and hearts brave enough to take a chance on love. What neither of them noticed was the figure watching from a car parked across the street, Eleanor Anderson, her expression hardening as she watched her son fall further from her carefully laid plans. The following weeks brought a delicate balance of professional dedication and blossoming romance. Sophie and Caleb maintained their composure at the office, but their evenings were filled with quiet dinners, long walks, and conversations that stretched into the night. However, Eleanor Anderson's watchful presence cast a constant shadow over their happiness. One morning, Sophie arrived at her desk to find an elegant envelope waiting for her. Inside was an invitation to the annual Anderson Software Gala, one of Seattle's most prestigious tech industry events. Her heart skipped when she noticed the handwritten note at the bottom. Your presence is required. EA. I see Mother's making her move, Caleb said later that day when they met for coffee in their usual spot. His face was tight with concern. The gala is her favorite playing field. She loves putting people in difficult situations while they're trying to maintain social graces. Sophie took a sip of her chai latte, considering. I can handle Eleanor Anderson in her natural habitat. I've dealt with worse. Have you? The question came from behind them, making them both start. Eleanor Anderson stood there, elegant as always in a tailored suit, her smile razor-sharp. Mind if I join you? Without waiting for an answer, she pulled out a chair and sat down, smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. I'm so glad I ran into you both. I wanted to discuss the gala arrangements personally. Mother, Caleb began, but Eleanor cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Sophie, dear, I took the liberty of having our personal stylist select something appropriate for you to wear. We can't have you feeling out of place." The condescension in her tone made Sophie's spine stiffen, but she kept her voice level. "That's very thoughtful, Mrs. Anderson, but I have something suitable." "Oh, I insist." Eleanor's smile didn't waver. "After all, you'll be representing Anderson Software. We have certain standards to maintain." Before Sophie could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "Sophie? Sophie Chen?" They all turned to see an elegant Asian man in his 50s standing near their table, his eyes fixed on Sophie with an unsettling intensity. Something about his expression made Sophie's heart stutter. There was recognition there, and something deeper. "I'm sorry. Do I know you?" Sophie asked, though something about his features tugged at her memory. The man opened his mouth to speak, then seemed to notice Eleanor and Caleb. His expression shuttered. "Forgive me, I must have been mistaken. You just remind me of someone I used to know." He hurried away before anyone could respond, leaving Sophie with an odd sense of displacement. She could have sworn she'd seen those same eyes before, perhaps in an old dream or a forgotten photograph. "Well, that was strange," Eleanor said, but something in her tone made Sophie look at her sharply. The older woman's face had gone slightly pale, her usual composure cracked. "Mother, are you all right?" Caleb asked, noticing it too. "Perfectly fine," Eleanor stood abruptly. "I just remembered an important meeting. Sophie, expect the dress to be delivered to your office tomorrow. Caleb, walk with me." As they left, Sophie could hear them arguing in low voices. But her mind was still on the mysterious man. Why had he seemed so familiar? And why had Eleanor reacted so strongly to his presence? That evening, as Sophie helped Mrs. Wu water her beloved orchids, she couldn't shake her unease. Have you ever felt like you're on the edge of discovering something important, but you can't quite grasp it? Mrs. Wu's hands stilled on the watering can. "In my experience, truth is like these orchids. It grows in its own time no matter how much we wish to hurry it along. But what if the truth changes everything?" Sophie asked softly. "Then perhaps everything needs to change." Mrs. Wu touched Sophie's cheek gently. "Your heart is strong enough to handle whatever blooms from these seeds of truth." Later that night, Sophie sat at her computer, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined expression. The mysterious man's face wouldn't leave her thoughts. On an impulse, she began searching through Seattle's business news archives, looking for Asian tech executives who might frequent the same circles as the Andersons. After hours of searching, she found him, Marcus Wei, CEO of Wei Innovations, a major player in the Asian tech market. According to the article, he had recently returned to Seattle after 15 years in Singapore, looking to expand his company's American presence. But it was the older article linked in the sidebar that made Sophie's blood freeze. Dated 28 years ago, it detailed a scandal involving Marcus Wei and a local woman named Hazel Mitchell. The article was brief, mentioning only that Mitchell had disappeared following Wei's hasty return to Singapore, reportedly under pressure from his family. 28 years ago. The same year, Sophie had been left at the New Hope orphanage. With trembling fingers, Sophie opened another tab and began searching for photos of Hazel Mitchell. It took several attempts, but finally, she found an old community newsletter featuring a group photo. There, smiling at the camera, was a young woman with Sophie's eyes and smile. The room seemed to spin as pieces of a puzzle Sophie hadn't known she was solving clicked into place. The way Marcus Wei had looked at her, Eleanor's strange reaction, the timing of it all. Her phone buzzed with a text from Caleb. "Mother's being impossible about the gala. Don't let her intimidate you. You're stronger than she knows." Sophie stared at the message, her mind racing. Eleanor's determination to control her relationship with Caleb, her insistence on maintaining standards. Was it really just about social status? Or did Seattle's premier tech executive know something about the orphaned girl who had captured her son's heart? The gala was 3 days away. Sophie looked at the old photo of Hazel Mitchell again, then at Marcus Wei's business profile. One way or another, she was going to uncover the truth that Eleanor Anderson seemed so desperate to keep buried. The dress Eleanor sent was a masterpiece of subtle undermining, beautiful but clearly expensive, designed to make Sophie look like she was trying too hard to fit into a world that wasn't hers. She hung it in her closet, and pulled out her own green silk dress instead, adding Mrs. Wu's jade pendant for strength. "Perfect," Mrs. Wu declared when Sophie emerged from her room the evening of the gala. "You look like yourself, only more so." "I feel like I'm walking into a battle," Sophie admitted, adjusting her pendant. "Then walk in with your head high," Mrs. Wu said firmly. "Your worth is not determined by their judgment." The Anderson Software Gala was being held at the Olympic Sculpture Park, with the Space Needle gleaming against the sunset sky. Sophie took a deep breath before entering, reminding herself that she had every right to be there. Caleb was waiting just inside, handsome in his tuxedo. His face lit up when he saw her. "You didn't wear Mother's dress," he noted with approval. "I thought it best to be myself tonight," Sophie said, accepting his subtle kiss on her cheek. "Good," he murmured. "Because there's someone I want you to meet properly." He gestured across the room where Marcus Wei stood talking with a group of executives. Sophie's heart jumped. "Caleb, there's something I need to tell you." "Later," he promised, already guiding her through the crowd. "Trust me on this." As they approached, Marcus Wei turned as if sensing their presence. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Sophie, that same flash of recognition crossing his face. "Mr. Wei," Caleb said formally, "I believe you and Sophie had a brief encounter the other day. I wanted to introduce you properly. Sophie is our lead tech writer and my girlfriend." Marcus seemed to be drinking in Sophie's features. "Ms. Chen," he said softly, "I apologize for my behavior at the coffee shop. You remind me very much of someone I knew long ago." "Hazel Mitchell?" Sophie asked quietly. The color drained from Marcus's face. Behind them, there was the sound of breaking glass. They turned to see Eleanor Anderson standing there, a shattered champagne flute at her feet. "Mother," Caleb's voice was concerned, but Eleanor's eyes were locked on Sophie. "How dare you?" she hissed, her careful composure cracking. "How dare you come here and dredge up ancient history?" "Ancient history?" Marcus's voice had gone cold. "Is that what you call what you did, Eleanor? Destroying 2 lives to protect your precious social standing?" Sophie looked between them, pieces falling into place. "You knew," she said to Eleanor, "you knew who I was the moment I walked into your office." "Someone want to tell me what's going on?" Caleb asked, his hand tightening protectively around Sophie's waist. "Your mother orchestrated quite the scheme 28 years ago," Marcus said, his voice tight with old pain. "When she discovered that her husband's protégé, Hazel Mitchell, was carrying my child, she saw it as a threat to Anderson Software's pending merger with my family's company." Sophie felt as if all the air had been sucked from the room. "What did you do?" she asked Eleanor. "What I had to do to protect this company." Eleanor's voice was steel. "Hazel was brilliant, but naive. Marcus was promised to another woman, a marriage that would secure our position in the Asian market. Their foolish romance would have ruined everything. So you forced them apart." Sophie's voice shook. "And my mother, what happened to her?" "I gave her a choice," Eleanor said. "Leave Seattle and give up the baby, or watch her career be destroyed. I made sure the child would be well cared for." "Well cared for?" Sophie's laugh was bitter. "I grew up in an orphanage, Mrs. Anderson. I fought for every opportunity, every scrap of recognition. And now you have the audacity to try to control my life again." "Sophie," Marcus stepped forward, his eyes bright with tears. "I searched for years, but Eleanor had hidden your records too well. When I saw you at the coffee shop, I could hardly believe it. You look so much like your mother." "Where is she?" Sophie asked, her voice small. "Boston," Marcus said softly. "I found her 5 years ago. She never stopped thinking about you, never stopped regretting her choice." Caleb had been silent throughout this exchange, his face growing increasingly thunderous. Now he turned to his mother. "All this time, you knew. You hired Sophie, tried to control her relationship with me, all while knowing she was the daughter you helped separate from her parents." "I was protecting you," Eleanor insisted. "The merger." "The merger?" Caleb's voice rose. "You destroyed a family for a business deal, and then had the gall to try to keep Sophie and me apart because she wasn't our kind of people?" "It's a bit more complicated than that," a new voice joined the conversation. They turned to see Lucas Barrett, one of Seattle's most respected architects and a longtime friend of the Anderson family, standing nearby. "Eleanor, I think it's time to tell them everything." Eleanor's face went even paler. "Lucas, don't—" "The merger wasn't just about business," Lucas said, his eyes kind as they rested on Sophie. It was about hiding the fact that Anderson Software was on the brink of bankruptcy. Your mother's research, Sophie, her work on early AI algorithms, it saved the company. Eleanor used it to secure the merger, claiming it as Anderson Software's intellectual property. You stole my mother's work. Sophie felt sick. I protected everyone's interests. Eleanor's voice was desperate now. The company employed hundreds of people. One person's career versus hundreds of jobs. What would you have done? Told the truth, Sophie said firmly. Found another way. But then, I wasn't raised with the privilege of thinking I could play God with other people's lives. She turned to Marcus, her heart pounding. My mother, Hazel, you said she's in Boston. He nodded, pulling out his phone. I have her number. She's been hoping. That is, if you want. I do, Sophie said quickly. But first, she turned to Eleanor, drawing herself up to her full height. I quit, and I'll be taking copies of all my mother's original research with me. I'm sure the tech blogs would love to hear this story. You can't, Eleanor began, but Caleb cut her off. Yes, she can, and if you try to stop her, I'll back her up. It's time for Anderson Software to start over, Mother. The right way this time. The room had gone quiet, other guests pretending not to watch the drama unfolding before them. Sophie felt Caleb's hand slip into hers, steady and sure. Well, Lucas said into the silence, I'd say this is turning out to be quite the memorable gala. Sophie looked at her jade pendant, thinking of Mrs. Wu's words about truth growing in its own time. She had come to the gala expecting a battle of social status. Instead, she had found her past, her future, and the strength to claim both. The night wasn't over yet, and there were still many conversations to be had. With Marcus, with Hazel, with Caleb. But for the first time in her life, Sophie felt complete, as if a missing piece of her heart had finally clicked into place. She squeezed Caleb's hand, drawing strength from his unwavering support. Whatever came next, she would face it as herself. Sophie Chen, daughter of Hazel Mitchell and Marcus Way, a woman who had built herself from nothing and discovered she had been something all along. The morning after the gala, Sophie sat in her small kitchen, staring at her phone. Marcus had sent her Hazel's number along with a simple message. She's waiting for your call whenever you're ready. Mrs. Wu quietly placed a cup of jasmine tea in front of her. Sometimes the hardest bridges to cross are the ones we build in our minds. What do I even say? Sophie whispered. Hi, I'm the daughter you gave up 28 years ago. Say what's in your heart, Mrs. Wu advised, patting her hand. The words will come. Before Sophie could respond, there was a knock at the door. Caleb stood there, looking tired but determined. He'd changed from his tuxedo into casual clothes, but his hair was still disheveled from running his hands through it. A habit Sophie had noticed emerged when he was stressed. I thought you might want company, he said softly. Unless you'd rather be alone? Sophie shook her head, grateful for his presence. I was just about to call her Hazel, my mother. Mrs. Wu discreetly excused herself to tend her orchids, leaving them alone in the kitchen. Caleb sat beside Sophie, close enough to offer support but giving her space to breathe. With trembling fingers, Sophie dialed the number. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3. Hello. A woman's voice, warm and slightly hesitant, answered. Sophie's throat tightened. Hi, this is Sophie Chen. I believe you're my mother. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Sophie! Hazel's voice cracked. Oh my God, Sophie. I've dreamed of this moment for so long. Marcus Way found me, Sophie said, gripping Caleb's hand for support. He told me what happened. About Eleanor Anderson. That woman. Hazel's voice hardened momentarily, then softened again. But none of that matters now. Tell me about you, please. Tell me everything. So Sophie did. She told her mother about growing up in the orphanage, about discovering her love for computers, about working her way through school. She told her about Mrs. Wu's kindness, about her writing career, about meeting Caleb. You sound so accomplished, Hazel said proudly. I've followed your articles, you know, ever since Marcus found me and told me what field you were in. I couldn't believe it. My daughter, making complex technology accessible to everyone. It's like you took the best parts of both your father and me. Why didn't you try to find me sooner? Sophie asked, the question that had been burning in her heart. There was a long pause. Fear, Hazel finally admitted. Fear that you'd hate me for giving you up. Fear that Eleanor would somehow interfere again. She didn't just threaten my career, Sophie. She threatened to use her influence to make sure you'd never be adopted, that you'd be moved to a group home far from Seattle. I was young and scared, and I believed her. But your research, she stole it. The AI algorithms, Hazel sighed. Yes, they were groundbreaking for their time. Eleanor knew their value, knew they could save Anderson Software. When she found out about my pregnancy, she saw an opportunity. It was a perfect storm. Use my research to secure the merger with Way Innovations, while simultaneously removing the complication of Marcus's illegitimate child. Sophie felt Caleb tense beside her, but his thumb stroked soothing circles on her hand. What did you do after? I moved to Boston, started over, got my PhD, built a new career. But I never stopped thinking about you, never stopped regretting my choice. When Marcus found me 5 years ago, told me he'd been searching all this time, I realized I'd been a coward. I should have fought harder. You were young, Sophie said softly, surprising herself with the forgiveness in her voice. And Eleanor Anderson is a formidable opponent. Still, Hazel's voice was thick with emotion. I missed everything. Your first steps, your first words, your graduations. We can't get that time back, Sophie acknowledged. But maybe we can build something new? I'd like that, Hazel said quickly. More than anything. I'm actually presenting at a tech conference in Seattle next month. Perhaps... Yes, Sophie didn't hesitate. I'd love to meet you. They talked for another hour, sharing details of their lives, beginning to bridge the decades-long gap between them. When they finally hung up, Sophie felt drained but lighter somehow, as if a weight she hadn't known she was carrying had lifted. Caleb, who had remained a steady, silent presence throughout the call, finally spoke. How are you feeling? Overwhelmed, angry, hopeful. Sophie leaned into his embrace. I can't believe your mother. Former mother, Caleb corrected grimly. I spent all night going through company records after the gala. Lucas was right. She didn't just steal Hazel's research, she buried it so deep that no one would ever trace it back to its original source. The company's entire foundation is built on that theft. What are you going to do? What we're going to do, he emphasized, is make it right. I've called an emergency board meeting for Monday. Mother may be CEO, but she's not invincible. Once the board knows the truth, Sophie studied his face. This could damage your career too, you know. The scandal. Some things are more important than career advancement, Caleb said firmly, like integrity, justice. He touched her cheek gently. Love. The word hung between them, new and profound. Sophie caught his hand, pressing it more firmly against her cheek. You really mean that? With all my heart. Caleb's eyes were intense. Sophie, watching you tonight, your strength, your grace under pressure, your capacity for forgiveness. I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. Mrs. Wu chose that moment to bustle back into the kitchen, pretending not to notice them hastily separating. More tea? She asked innocently, but her knowing smile said she'd heard everything. Sophie looked between them, this man who loved her for exactly who she was, this woman who had become like a second mother to her, and felt a profound sense of peace. Her family might not look like what she'd imagined as a lonely child in the orphanage, but it was real, and it was hers. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. Hazel just called me, crying happy tears. Thank you for giving her a chance. Would you like to have dinner this week? There's so much I want to know about my daughter. Daughter. The word filled her heart with a warmth she'd never expected to feel. Sophie looked at Caleb, who nodded encouragingly, then typed back, I'd like that. Let's build some bridges. The Anderson Software Board meeting was scheduled for 9 a.m. Monday morning, but by 8:30 the company's sleek conference room was already filling with tense executives. Sophie watched from her desk as they filed in, some throwing curious glances her way. The weekend's gala dramatics had spread through Seattle's tech community like wildfire. Ready? Caleb appeared at her desk, holding 2 cups of coffee. Sophie took one gratefully. As I'll ever be. Are you sure you want me in there? You deserve to be part of this, he said firmly. It's your mother's legacy we're fighting for. They entered the conference room together, ignoring the whispers that followed. Eleanor sat at the head of the table, her usual impeccable appearance slightly strained. When she saw them, Her lips tightened, but she said nothing. Lucas Barrett was already there, along with Marcus Way, who had insisted on attending as a major shareholder. Sophie took strength from their supportive presence as she and Caleb took their seats. "Before we begin," Eleanor said, her voice carefully controlled, "I want to emphasize that any decisions made today must prioritize the company's stability." "The company's stability?" Caleb interrupted, standing. "Let's talk about that, Mother. Let's talk about how that stability was built on stolen research and destroyed lives." He proceeded to lay out the evidence they'd gathered over the weekend, the buried paper trail of Hazel's original work, the suspicious timing of the merger, the systematic erasure of her contributions. The very algorithms that form the foundation of our AI division were developed by Hazel Mitchell, Caleb concluded. Everything we've built since then has been based on her innovative approach to machine learning. Our success is built on her genius and your theft. The board members exchanged troubled looks. One of them, a silver-haired woman named Patricia Moore, spoke up. "These are serious allegations, Eleanor. What do you have to say in your defense?" Eleanor's composure finally cracked. "Everything I did was to save this company. We were weeks away from bankruptcy. Hundreds of jobs were at stake. Hazel's research was revolutionary, yes, but she was going to publish it openly. I saw an opportunity to save everything my husband had built by destroying my family." Sophie stood, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "By separating a child from her parents? By continuing to manipulate and control people's lives decades later?" "I gave you opportunities," Eleanor snapped. "I hired you, offered you advancement. You hired me to control me," Sophie corrected, "to keep me close where you could manage the situation if I ever discovered the truth. But you didn't count on one thing, Mrs. Anderson. And what's that? That your son would be a better person than you raised him to be." Caleb reached for her hand, squeezing it supportively. Eleanor's eyes tracked the gesture, something like defeat finally crossing her face. "The board needs to convene privately," Patricia announced. "Eleanor, given the circumstances, we'll need you to step out." The next hour was the longest of Sophie's life. She sat with Caleb in the building's cafe, neither of them touching their coffee, while Marcus made calls to his lawyers and Lucas worked his connections with other board members. Finally, Patricia herself came to fetch them. The board's decision was unanimous. Eleanor would be asked to resign, effective immediately. A full investigation would be launched into the company's founding, with the intention of properly crediting and compensating Hazel Mitchell for her work. Furthermore, Patricia added, looking at Caleb, the board would like to offer you the position of interim CEO with a mandate to reform the company's ethical guidelines and restore its reputation. Caleb looked stunned. I need time to think about it." "Of course," Patricia smiled. "But consider this. Who better to rebuild trust than someone who was willing to sacrifice everything to expose the truth?" As they left the building that evening, Sophie felt as if she were walking in a dream. So much had changed in just 3 days. Her family, her job, her understanding of her own history. "Move in with me," Caleb said suddenly as they waited for the elevator. Sophie blinked in surprise. "What?" "I know it's fast," he admitted, "but nothing about our story has been conventional. I love you, Sophie. These past few days have shown me that life is too short to waste time worrying about what others think is proper." "I have a commitment to Mrs. Wu," Sophie reminded him, though her heart was racing. "So we'll find a bigger place," Caleb said, "one with a garden for her orchids. She's family too, isn't she?" Sophie felt tears prick at her eyes. "You'd do that?" "I'd do anything for you," he said simply. "You've taught me what real strength looks like, what it means to stand up for what's right. Let me show you what real love looks like in return." Before Sophie could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from Hazel. "Just heard the news about Anderson Software. Are you okay? Also, I booked my flight for next week instead of next month. I hope that's not too soon." Sophie looked at the message, then at Caleb's hopeful face, and felt the future unfurling before her like a bright path. "It's not too soon," she said, responding to both of them. "It's exactly right." As they stepped into the elevator together, Sophie caught their reflection in the mirrored walls, she and Caleb standing tall, facing forward, ready for whatever came next. She thought about the lonely little girl in the orphanage who used to dream about belonging somewhere, to someone. That girl could never have imagined this moment, this feeling of being completely and utterly whole. Her phone buzzed again, a message from Marcus asking about dinner plans, followed quickly by one from Mrs. Wu reminding her to pick up more jasmine tea. Sophie smiled, realizing that her family hadn't just grown. It had multiplied in beautiful, unexpected ways. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb asked, noting her expression. "That sometimes," Sophie said softly, "the best families are the ones we build ourselves, one bridge at a time." The elevator doors opened to the Seattle evening, where a gentle rain was washing the city clean. Together they stepped out into their new beginning. The arrival area at SeaTac Airport buzzed with its usual energy, but Sophie barely noticed the crowds. Her eyes were fixed on the escalator coming down from the terminal, her heart pounding with each new face that appeared. Beside her, Caleb held her hand steadily, while Marcus Way stood a few steps back, giving them space while remaining supportive. "That's her," Sophie whispered suddenly, spotting a woman with familiar eyes descending the escalator. Hazel Mitchell looked exactly like her photos, a graceful woman in her early 50s, with Sophie's dark eyes and determined chin. She scanned the crowd anxiously until her gaze landed on Sophie. Time seemed to stop as mother and daughter saw each other in person for the first time in 28 years. Sophie didn't remember moving, but suddenly she was walking forward, drawn by an invisible force. Hazel stepped off the escalator, her carry-on bag forgotten at her feet, and then they were face to face. "Sophie," Hazel breathed, reaching out tentatively to touch her daughter's cheek. "You're even more beautiful in person." Sophie leaned into the touch, tears spilling down her face. "Mom," she said, testing the word she'd never had the chance to use before. They fell into each other's arms, both crying now. 28 years of separation, dissolving in a moment of pure connection. Sophie breathed in her mother's scent, something floral and familiar, as if her heart remembered what her mind could not. "I'm so sorry," Hazel whispered against her hair. "I'm so sorry I wasn't strong enough to fight for you." "You're here now," Sophie said firmly. "That's what matters." A discreet cough reminded them they weren't alone. Sophie pulled back, wiping her eyes, and turned to see Caleb and Marcus watching with matching expressions of joy and respect. "Hazel," Marcus stepped forward, his voice gentle. "It's good to see you again." Hazel's smile was warm but slightly shy. "Marcus, thank you for finding our daughter." The word "our" hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Sophie looked between her biological parents, seeing pieces of herself in both of them, her father's analytical mind, her mother's expressive eyes, their shared passion for technology and innovation. "Let's get your bags," Caleb suggested diplomatically. "Mrs. Wu is preparing a welcome dinner for everyone." During the drive to Mrs. Wu's house, Hazel couldn't stop looking at Sophie, as if memorizing every detail of her face. "Tell me about Mrs. Wu," she requested. "She sounds wonderful from our phone conversations." Sophie smiled, thinking of her elderly friend. "She's been like a grandmother to me. When I was struggling to afford housing while building my career, she offered me a home. But it became so much more than just a place to live. She gave you the nurturing I should have," Hazel said softly. "Different kinds of love can coexist," Sophie assured her. "Mrs. Wu taught me that family isn't just about blood. It's about who chooses to stay in your life, who supports your dreams." They arrived at Mrs. Wu's house to find it filled with the aroma of traditional Chinese cooking. The elderly woman had outdone herself, preparing an elaborate feast to welcome Hazel. "So," Mrs. Wu said as they gathered around her dining table, "finally I meet the mother of my Sophie. You have her eyes." "I think it's the other way around," Hazel smiled, passing a dish of dumplings. "Though I understand you've been more of a mother to her than I ever was." "Ah," Mrs. Wu waved her hand dismissively. "The heart has room for many kinds of love. See how my orchids bloom differently but beautifully. Same with family." The evening flowed naturally, years of separation softening under good food and warm conversation. Hazel shared stories about her work in Boston, her eyes lighting up when she talked about her current research in artificial intelligence ethics. "That's actually part of why I came early," she admitted, glancing at Caleb. "I heard about the changes at Anderson Software. If you're serious about reforming the company's ethical guidelines, I'd like to help." Caleb sat up straighter. "Really? That would be incredible. Your expertise in AI ethics is exactly what we need. Plus," Hazel added with a slight smile, "it would give me a reason to spend more time in Seattle, If that's something you'd want, Sophie. Yes, Sophie said immediately. Yes, I'd like that very much. Marcus cleared his throat. Way Innovations has been looking to establish a stronger presence in Seattle as well. Perhaps there's room for collaboration? The conversation turned to possibilities, of partnerships, of reconciliation, of building something new from the ashes of old wrongs. Sophie sat back, watching her unlikely family interact, her biological parents finding their way back to friendship, if not romance, Mrs. Wu sharing her wisdom through carefully chosen proverbs, Caleb offering support and suggestions while respecting the delicate family dynamics. Later that evening, as they were cleaning up, Hazel pulled Sophie aside. "I need to show you something," she said, reaching into her bag. She pulled out a worn notebook, its pages yellow with age. "My original research notes from before everything. I want you to have them." Sophie took the notebook reverently. "But these are yours. They're part of your history," Hazel said firmly. "And maybe they could be part of your future too. I see how you make complex ideas accessible in your writing. You have a gift for bridging worlds, Sophie. Technology and humanity, past and present, different kinds of families." Sophie ran her fingers over the faded pages, feeling the weight of history and possibility in her hands. "Thank you," she whispered. "No," Hazel touched her cheek gently. "Thank you for giving me a chance to be part of your life." Through the kitchen window, Sophie could see Caleb and Marcus deep in conversation in the garden, while Mrs. Wu arranged her orchids on the windowsill. The scene struck her as a perfect metaphor for her life, different elements coming together to create something unexpectedly beautiful. "You know," she said to her mother, "I used to think finding my biological parents would answer all my questions about who I am. But I'm realizing it's not about finding answers, it's about expanding possibilities." Hazel's eyes filled with tears of understanding. "You're wiser than I was at your age, much wiser." "I had good teachers," Sophie smiled, thinking of Mrs. Wu's orchid metaphors and life lessons. "And now I have even more." The evening wrapped around them like a warm blanket, full of promise and possibility. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Integrating Hazel into the new Anderson software, navigating complex family dynamics, building bridges between past and present. But for now, in this moment, Sophie felt perfectly, completely at peace. The weeks following Hazel's arrival brought a whirlwind of changes. Sophie and Caleb found a beautiful craftsman house in Queen Anne with a separate garden cottage, perfect for Mrs. Wu. The elderly woman's orchids now filled a custom-built greenhouse, their delicate blooms a testament to patience and careful nurturing. "Just like family," Mrs. Wu would say, tending to her plants. "Some need more sun, some need more shade, but all need love to grow strong." Hazel had taken an apartment nearby, close enough for impromptu visits, but giving everyone space to adjust to their new dynamics. She and Sophie spent countless hours together, making up for lost time while building a new kind of relationship, part mother-daughter, part friends, part professional colleagues. One sunny Saturday morning, Sophie sat in her new home office, surrounded by moving boxes, reading through her mother's old research notebook. The elegant handwriting detailed theories that had been decades ahead of their time, especially regarding the ethical implications of artificial intelligence. "Tea?" Caleb appeared in the doorway, holding 2 steaming mugs. "Thanks," Sophie accepted one gratefully. "I can't believe how relevant Mum's work still is. Her concerns about AI bias and ethical development, these are exactly the issues we're grappling with today." Caleb settled into the window seat beside her desk. "The board is thrilled about her joining as our ethics director. Her reputation in the field is impeccable, and having her help reshape the company's approach to AI development is exactly what we need." "And Marcus's offer to partner on the new research center?" Sophie asked, thinking of her father's proposal to establish a joint AI ethics research facility. "Being finalized as we speak," Caleb smiled. "It's amazing how things work out sometimes. A month ago, Anderson Software was built on buried secrets. Now we're becoming a leader in ethical AI development." Sophie closed her mother's notebook thoughtfully, all because people were brave enough to face the truth and choose a better path. Speaking of better paths, Caleb set down his mug and reached for her hand. "There's something I want to ask you." Sophie's heart skipped a beat as he pulled a small box from his pocket, but instead of opening it, he held it closed in his palm. "Before I do this," he said seriously. "I want you to know that it has nothing to do with making up for the past, or trying to give you the family you didn't have growing up. You've shown me that family is something we build through love and choice, not obligation or guilt." Sophie squeezed his hand encouragingly. "I know that, Caleb." He smiled, some tension leaving his shoulders. "Good, because I'm not asking you to be part of my family. You've helped me create a whole new one, better than anything I had before. I'm asking you to let me be part of yours, to keep building this beautiful thing we've started together." He opened the box, revealing a ring that perfectly balanced elegance and simplicity. "Sophie Chen, will you marry me?" Sophie looked at the ring, then at the man holding it, this person who had chosen truth over comfort, love over convention, who had helped her find her past while believing in their future. "Yes," she said, her voice full of certainty. "Absolutely yes." The ring slid perfectly onto her finger, as if it had been waiting there all along. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Wu in her greenhouse, Hazel helping her repot an orchid while Marcus examined a particularly rare bloom. Their voices drifted up faintly, punctuated by laughter. "Should we go tell them?" Caleb asked, nodding toward their family below. "In a minute," Sophie said, pulling him close for a kiss. "Let's just enjoy this moment first." Later that evening, they all gathered in the main house for dinner, a tradition they'd established over the past weeks. Mrs. Wu had taught Hazel her secret dumpling recipe, while Marcus brought wine from his recent trip to Singapore. The announcement of the engagement was met with joyful tears and knowing smiles. "I knew from the moment you first helped me with my orchids," Mrs. Wu declared. "Some hearts are meant to grow together, like some minds," Hazel added, sharing a warm look with Marcus. While they hadn't rekindled their romance, they had found a deep friendship based on shared history and mutual respect. As Sophie looked around the table at her extraordinary family, her mother's brilliant smile, her father's proud eyes, Mrs. Wu's wise contentment, and Caleb's steady love, she thought about the little girl she'd been, longing for connection in the orphanage. "What are you thinking?" Caleb murmured, noticing her thoughtful expression. "That sometimes the longest roads lead us exactly where we need to be," she replied. "And that family isn't just something we're born into or find. It's something we choose to build, every day, with love and courage and faith. And sometimes," Mrs. Wu added, overhearing, "the most beautiful gardens grow in unexpected places." The evening light filtered through the windows, casting a golden glow over their gathering. Outside, the Seattle skyline sparkled against the darkening sky, a reminder of how far they'd all come and how many possibilities still lay ahead. Sophie touched her engagement ring, feeling its weight of promise and possibility. She had spent so many years wondering about her past, never imagining that finding it would lead her not backward, but forward into a future brighter than any she could have dreamed. 6 months after the engagement, Sophie stood in front of her laptop in the newly established Anderson Way Center for Ethical AI Development, reviewing the final draft of her latest article. The piece detailed how the merger between Anderson Software and Way Innovations had revolutionized the approach to ethical AI development in the Pacific Northwest. Still perfecting that article, Hazel's voice came from the doorway of Sophie's office. She had fully settled into her role as ethics director, bringing a wealth of experience and a fresh perspective to the company. "Just finished, actually," Sophie smiled, turning to face her mother. Hard to believe how much has changed in half a year. "Speaking of change," Hazel entered the office carrying a carefully preserved box. "I found something while going through my old things in Boston. I think you should have it for tomorrow." Sophie opened the box to find a delicate silk scarf, its pattern reminiscent of cherry blossoms. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "I wore it the day I met your father," Hazel said softly. I'd always hoped to pass it on to my daughter on her wedding day. Even during all those years apart, I kept it safe." Tears pricked at Sophie's eyes as she carefully lifted the scarf. "That's perfect for something borrowed and something old. And something that bridges past and present," Hazel added, her own eyes glistening. "Sophie, I know I've said this before, but watching you these past months, seeing the woman you've become, the family you've built, the way you've opened your heart to forgiveness and love, I'm so proud to be your mother." Sophie hugged her tightly, the scarf carefully preserved between them. "I'm proud to be your daughter. And Mom, I understand now. About the choices you made back then. They weren't right or wrong, they were just human. A knock at the door interrupted their emotional moment. Marcus stood there, looking slightly uncomfortable. Sorry to interrupt, but there's someone here who wants to speak with Sophie. Sophie's breath caught when she saw who followed him into the office. Eleanor Anderson, looking older and somehow smaller than she had 6 months ago. Ms. Chen, Sophie, Eleanor began, her usual polish slightly cracked. I know I'm probably the last person you want to see before your wedding, but I needed to. That is, I hope you'll let me. Would you like to sit down? Sophie offered, gesturing to a chair. Hazel quietly excused herself, touching Sophie's shoulder supportively as she left. Eleanor sat stiffly, her hands clasped in her lap. I've been doing a lot of thinking these past months. Therapy, actually, at Caleb's insistence. She smiled faintly. My son can be quite persistent when he believes in something. Or someone. He can, Sophie agreed cautiously. What I did to your family, to both your families, Eleanor continued, glancing at Marcus, was unforgivable. I convinced myself I was protecting the company, protecting my family's legacy. But really, I was just protecting my own need for control. Why are you telling me this now? Sophie asked. Because tomorrow you're marrying my son, Eleanor said simply. And while I know I have no right to ask anything of you, I want you to know that I see now what Caleb saw from the beginning. How extraordinary you are, not despite your past, but because of it. Sophie studied the woman who had once seemed so formidable. You know this doesn't fix everything. No, Eleanor agreed. Nothing can fix the years I stole from your family. But perhaps we can build something new. Something better. Sophie thought about Mrs. Wu's wisdom about different flowers blooming in their own time. It won't be easy, she warned. The most worthwhile things rarely are, Eleanor said, echoing words Sophie herself had spoken months ago. Before Sophie could respond, Caleb appeared in the doorway, stopping short when he saw his mother. His face tightened, but Sophie crossed to him, taking his hand. Your mother was just leaving, she said gently, but I think we should invite her to tea next week if you're comfortable with that. Caleb looked between them, understanding the olive branch being extended. Tea would be a start. Eleanor stood, smoothing her skirt in a gesture Sophie now recognized as nervousness rather than superiority. Thank you, both of you. I'll see myself out. After she left, Caleb pulled Sophie close. You never cease to amaze me with your capacity for grace. I learned from the best, Sophie smiled, thinking of Mrs. Wu's patient wisdom and her mother's quiet strength. Besides, tomorrow is about new beginnings. It feels right to leave the past where it belongs. Speaking of tomorrow, Caleb grinned, I should get going. Bad luck to see the bride the night before the wedding and all that. Since when are you superstitious? Since I realized how lucky I am to have found you. Not taking any chances now. He kissed her softly, then more deeply, until Marcus cleared his throat pointedly from the doorway. If you're quite finished, Sophie, your mother and Mrs. Wu are waiting. Something about final dress alterations? Sophie laughed, gathering her things. Tomorrow would bring its own magic, but tonight was for family traditions both old and new. For Mrs. Wu's dumplings and Hazel's stories, for Marcus's quiet pride, and the delicate silk scarf that had waited so long to be passed down. As she left the office, Sophie paused to look back at the plaque on the wall. Anderson Way Center for Ethical AI Development, where innovation meets integrity. Below it in smaller letters, founded on the pioneering work of Dr. Hazel Mitchell. Sometimes, she reflected, the longest journeys led right back home. Not to the place you started, but to the place you were always meant to be. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, a rare, perfect Seattle day. Mrs. Wu's greenhouse had been transformed into a getting-ready space, the orchids providing a natural backdrop as Sophie prepared for the ceremony. Something old, Hazel said, carefully arranging her silk scarf in Sophie's dark hair. Something new, Mrs. Wu added, fastening a delicate jade bracelet around Sophie's wrist, a gift from both her and Marcus. Something borrowed, Sophie touched the vintage pearl earrings Caleb's grandmother had sent, along with a note expressing her joy at welcoming Sophie to the family. And something blue, Hazel finished, touching the small blue forget-me-not flowers woven into Sophie's bouquet. The wedding itself was being held in the Volunteer Park Conservatory, its Victorian glass walls creating a cathedral of light and greenery. It was Mrs. Wu who had suggested the venue, noting how it perfectly represented Sophie and Caleb's story, a place where different kinds of beauty grew together, protected and nurtured. "Ready?" Marcus appeared at the greenhouse door, looking distinguished in his tuxedo. His eyes grew misty when he saw Sophie in her elegant gown. "You look just like your mother on the day I first met her." Hazel, helping adjust Sophie's train, smiled at the memory, though I seem to remember being much more nervous. "I'm not nervous," Sophie realized with surprise. "Everything just feels right." The short walk from the greenhouse to the conservatory was like a dream. Seattle's tech community had turned out in force to support the union of Anderson Software's new CEO and its pioneering ethics director's daughter. But Sophie barely noticed the crowd. Her eyes were fixed on Caleb, waiting for her beneath an arch of orchids that Mrs. Wu had specially cultivated for the occasion. Their vows were personal and heartfelt. Caleb spoke of finding strength in Sophie's resilience, of learning to stand up for what was right through her example. Sophie spoke of building bridges between worlds, of the family they had created together from unlikely pieces. "Like a garden," she said, smiling at Mrs. Wu in the front row. "Our love has grown in unexpected ways, more beautiful for being unconventional." When the officiant pronounced them married, the conservatory erupted in applause. Sophie caught glimpses of familiar faces through happy tears, Lucas Barrett beaming proudly, Eleanor dabbing at her eyes in the back row, her colleagues from the tech world cheering enthusiastically. The reception was held in the park's rose garden, strings of lights turning the evening into a fairy tale. Mrs. Wu had coordinated with local restaurants to create a feast that blended cultures and traditions, just like their family. "A toast," Marcus stood, raising his glass, "to my daughter, who taught me that it's never too late to rebuild what was lost, and to my new son-in-law, who showed us all that integrity is the truest form of success. To family," Hazel added, standing beside him, "both the ones we're born to and the ones we choose. To love that bridges all gaps," Mrs. Wu contributed, her wise eyes twinkling. As the evening progressed, Sophie found a quiet moment with Caleb near the koi pond. The setting sun painted the Seattle skyline in shades of gold and rose, the Space Needle standing like an exclamation point against the dramatic sky. "Happy?" Caleb asked, pulling her close. "More than I ever thought possible," Sophie answered honestly. "Looking back, it's hard to believe how everything started. Me walking into your mother's office, terrified of being judged inadequate. And now look at you, leading our AI ethics initiatives, revolutionizing how we approach technology and humanity." He kissed her temple softly. "You never needed anyone's approval. You just needed the chance to show the world who you are." "We all did," Sophie mused, watching their family mingle on the terrace. Mrs. Ver was teaching Hazel some secret about orchid care, while Marcus looked on fondly. Eleanor, who had been quietly respectful all day, was engaged in what appeared to be a genuine conversation with Lucas about company reforms. "You know what Mrs. Wu would say?" Caleb smiled. "Different flowers bloom in their own time," they said together, laughing. The music changed to a slow song, and Caleb pulled Sophie onto the dance floor. As they swayed together, Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, feeling completely at peace. "I love you," she whispered, "not just for who you are, but for who you helped me be." "And I love you," he replied, "for showing me that true strength isn't about maintaining control. It's about having the courage to let love change you." Around them, their gathered family and friends continued celebrating, but in that moment, they were in a world of their own. Sophie thought about the little girl in the orphanage who used to dream about belonging somewhere. If she could have seen this future, this beautiful, imperfect, authentic future, would she have believed it? The answer, Sophie realized, didn't matter. What mattered was that she had never stopped believing in the possibility of love, never stopped working toward her dreams, never stopped building bridges between hearts and minds. As the stars began to appear above Seattle's glittering skyline, Sophie looked around at her extraordinary family, her brilliant mother, her devoted father, her wise Mrs. Wu, her reformed mother-in-law, and her beloved husband. Each relationship was unique, each connection special in its own way. Together they formed a tapestry more beautiful than any single thread could create alone. "Ready to go home?" Caleb asked as the reception began to wind down. Sophie smiled, touching her mother's scarf in her hair, feeling Mrs. Wu's jade bracelet on her wrist, seeing the love in her father's eyes as he bid them good night. "I am home," she said simply, "right here with all of you." And in that moment, surrounded by the family she had both found and created, Sophie knew that some stories didn't need fairy tale endings to be magical. They just needed love, courage, and the wisdom to recognize that the most beautiful gardens grow not from perfect conditions, but from hearts brave enough to bloom wherever they're planted.